Mr. President, yesterday we gathered here in connection with a concrete threat to international peace and security, namely Kiev's ongoing bombing of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is putting Europe on the brink of a nuclear catastrophe. We took note of the explanations of the Secretary General for why he did not take part in yesterday's meeting. Today's meeting, however, is formally not related to developments on the ground at all and is meant to demonstrate the unfailing support of Western delegations for any actions of the Kiev regime. We have predictably heard plenty of mantras about Russian aggression. As we have already said, over the past 200 years, no other explanation for European security issues except for references to Russia's actions has emerged in the West. Today, we also heard many claims about the catastrophic consequences of 6 months of hostilities for the civilian population of Ukraine. No one is arguing that it is difficult for Ukrainians today. However, the responsibility for this lies with the Kiev regime, which came to power in 2014 as a result of an anti-constitutional coup carried out with the help of a number of Western states. From the very beginning, the new Maidan authorities have been steadily leading the country to disaster, choosing the path of Russophobia and the glorification of Nazi criminals. Thus, according to the most conservative estimates, more than 60% of the population of Ukraine was deprived of the opportunity to realize their Russian-speaking identity, contrary to all relevant international conventions and Ukraine's obligations. Their Western backers, blinded by the geopolitical goal of weakening Russia, made it clear from the beginning they would cover up any crimes committed by the Kiev authorities and turn a blind eye to things that they would never allow in their own countries. The Kiev regime fully demonstrated its criminal nature when it burnt dissenters alive in the House of Trade Unions in Odessa and dropped bombs and shells on the civilian population of Donbass. In this senseless crusade against itself, Ukraine lost Crimea and provoked armed resistance from Donetsk and Lugansk residents who took up arms in the name of freedom and the future of their children. This war, which claimed the lives of civilians for 8 years, could have ended if Kiev had fulfilled the Minsk agreements. However, neither the Ukrainian authorities nor their foreign patrons needed this. They openly stated this once again at the beginning of this year while threatening to abandon their non-nuclear status. In such a context, in order to establish peace in the Donbass and to prevent the obvious threats to Russia emanating from Ukraine, we had no choice but to launch a special operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, the goals of which are being successfully and steadily fulfilled. I repeat once again, if the Minsk agreements had been implemented, no special operation would have been needed. But the regime in Kiev decided otherwise. The criminal shelling of the republics of Donbass continues. In the Donetsk People's Republic, more than 840 people are estimated to have died on the line of contact since the beginning of the escalation in February, about 2,800 injured. In the Luhansk People's Republic, 80 people were killed and more than 250 were injured. Approximately 100 civilians have been killed in just 4 weeks since the previous meeting on July 29th. The armed forces of Ukraine are purposefully destroying civilian infrastructure, including kindergartens, schools, and medical facilities, power lines, and gas pipelines. They do not spare even those cities in Donbass that until recently were under their control, such as Lysychansk, for example. And our former Western partners, instead of condemning their Ukrainian mentees, are supplying them with more and more new types of weapons, which reach areas that Kiev could not previously reach. In doing this, they are becoming accomplices in crimes against the civilian population. And given that the use of some artillery systems, as the Ukrainians themselves admit, is impossible without coordinating the targets with suppliers, they are becoming co-perpetrators as well. This primarily concerns the American HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems, which were used, for instance, to strike the correctional facility in Yelenivka on July 29th, claiming the lives of more than 50 Ukrainian prisoners of war. We know that the president of Ukraine is well aware of the fact that it is the armed forces of Ukraine who are behind this crime, despite the fact that he sold us a false version today of Russia being responsible for this. Mr. President, from the very beginning, we warned that Ukrainian armed groups were actively using civilian facilities for military purposes. Meanwhile, local residents are prohibited from leaving their homes, and all their attempts to independently evacuate to safe areas are brutally suppressed. There have been so many incidents of Ukrainian artillery and ammunition being situated on the territory of educational and medical facilities over these 6 months that even pro-Western human rights organizations such as Amnesty International can no longer ignore them. However, instead of forcing Kyiv to comply with international humanitarian law, our Western colleagues, after the tantrum thrown by Ukrainian authorities who are used to getting away with everything, chose to publicly castigate Amnesty International itself instead. And today, Ms. DiCarlo found words to express concern in connection with the upcoming trial of Azov Nazis and sadists, but said nothing of the horrific crimes they committed and their violations of international humanitarian law, including brutal torture, information regarding which is available to the international civil service community and including Ms. DiCarlo herself. And the United Nations has enough information about this as well, the UN, whom Ms. DiCarlo represents. This all, frankly, looks extremely cynical and denigrates the values of freedom of speech. And it's a shame that you don't understand this, but ordinary Ukrainians are well aware of this. They encounter the atrocities of the armed forces of Ukraine and the national battalions and their inhumane methods. Allow me to cite just one example. At the meeting in July, we already showed you a photo of the Lepestok or petal anti-personnel mine. Today, for greater clarity, I will show you the training models for these mines, which Ukrainian troops scatter by the hundreds in the Donbass and the territories liberated by the Russian army and even throw them into the territory of Russia. Imagine such an inconspicuous petal lying on the ground in the grass. It can also be camouflage colored, which makes it virtually invisible on the ground. Considering that the Ukrainian armed forces scatter these mines in towns and villages far behind the front lines, it is not soldiers that they pose a threat to at all. No, they are purposefully designed to target civilians, especially children who risk stepping on them or picking up such a toy out of curiosity. 47 explosions of such mines have already been recorded in the Donetsk People's Republic. This petal mine is living proof of the sadistic, savage nature of the Ukrainian regime and a symbol of its true attitude towards the people of the east and southeast of the country. And of course, the people see and understand this, hence the treatment of Russian soldiers as liberators, which is widespread in the liberated territories. This in no way fits into the narrative promoted by Kyiv and its Western sponsors. Ukraine is therefore resorting to terror and intimidation tactics in the Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Kharkiv regions. But this cannot change the minds of people who have seen the true face of the Kyiv regime. Kyiv is losing the battle for minds, and its Western backers, who are waging a proxy war against Russia to the last Ukrainian, are getting mired deeper and deeper in supporting this anti-popular, anti-human regime, turning a blind eye to manifestations of neo-Nazism, extreme nationalism, and Russophobia. They are also shooting themselves in the foot with futile attempts to isolate Russia politically and economically. Then again, that is something you will have to answer for to your own voters and taxpayers, as you will have to answer to the international community for the unprecedented mendacious campaign to discredit Russia that you have unleashed. Never before, since Nazi Goebbels propaganda has the world encountered such a degree of falsification, which Western and Ukrainian PSYOPs experts are using. There is no doubt that history will be able to give the correct assessment to all this. Our Albanian colleague propounded today, Albanese, about Russian prisoners that are allegedly being recruited by the Russian authorities. However, he forgot to mention those released from Ukrainian prisons, Ukrainian prisoners who were handed out weapons in the very first days of the special military operation and who made themselves known by pillaging and murders and continued to terrorize Ukrainian towns. We will go into this in detail at one of the future meetings of the Council. Mr. President, The so-called Black Sea Initiative of the UN Secretary General is considered to be a sort of success story, especially in terms of the unhindered export of food from Ukraine. However, there are alarming trends here as well. Over the 4 weeks of export operations, only one of the 34 dry cargo ships went to Africa. This is completely inconsistent with the originally stated goal of combating hunger in countries in dire need of grain. Here, of course, it is also worth recalling the public image failure with the sending of the first vessel, Rosoni, which essentially, instead of bringing long-awaited wheat to Lebanon, brought corn instead, and corn for animal feed at that. In this context, there is much to think about regarding the comment made by the Secretary General in the port of Odessa on August 19th, when he said that grain exports and reduced prices on global markets will not bring relief to needy countries who cannot afford to buy them anyway. This situation clearly reveals the true causes of global food security issues. Ukrainian grain has nothing to do with it. The main reason is Western countries' own economic miscalculations and the consequences of anti-Russian sanctions, which we've repeatedly spoken about in this chamber. It was the sanctions that ruptured logistical and financial chains, which in turn provoked a sharp drop in market supply. Excuses about the supposedly targeted nature of unilateral measures cannot fill hungry people's stomachs. We call on all those involved to take the package nature of the Black Sea Initiative with full seriousness and not to postpone resolving the financial and logistical problems that impede the export of Russian food and fertilizers to the global market. We emphasize that the extension of the grain deal, the term of which is 120 days from the date of signing, would be facilitated by tangible results for Russian foreign trade operators equivalent to those we are seeing for Ukrainian exports. So far, there are still significant reserves in this part of the grain deal. Mr. President, it is no secret that the Western colleagues who requested today's meeting were resolved to have it coincide with the Independence Day of Ukraine. Much has been said about this today. A number of our colleagues directly point to Russia as a threat to Ukrainian independence. We cannot agree with this. 8 years after the launch of the Maidan project, it has become obvious that the main and, in fact, the only threat to the independence of Ukraine is the current government in Kiev. Over these years, robust mechanisms have been formed for the external governance of Ukraine, which are visible to the naked eye. We know that at all levels of government, in all the key agencies of this country, there are Western advisors without whose concurrence not a single major decision is made. It is enough to recall how in 2014, the notorious Victoria Nuland resolved issues regarding the formation of the Ukrainian government by phone with the American ambassador in Kiev, or recall the current president of the United States, Joe Biden, boasting that he had used crude blackmail to remove the prosecutor general of Ukraine. If this is independence, then what is dependence? And is there anything for Ukrainians to celebrate on this day? Throughout Zelensky's reign, and particularly since February 24th, the opposition has been completely eliminated in the country. Dissent has been suppressed. Opposition media have been shut down. People are being persecuted, arrested, and put in prison just for reading Russian language news and watching Russian channels. And now, in accordance with the new law on collaborationism, they're also being imprisoned for accepting humanitarian assistance for Ukraine from Russia. Ukraine has become fully transformed into a backwards, ruthless anti-Russia and is confidently moving towards a complete ideological and political bankruptcy. In order to assess the degree of this profound Russophobic degradation, I would like to once again quote the words said the other day by Ukrainian ambassador to Kazakhstan, Petro Verblevsky. After the murder of Daria Dugina, he openly declared, and I quote, "We are trying to kill as many of them as possible. The more Russians we kill now, the fewer our children will have to kill. That's all." End of quote. And this was said by the ambassador of a country in which these same Russians not only live, but make up a very significant part of the population. Does such a country and such an inhumane regime have a future? Our Western colleagues can prolong its agony, but they cannot prevent its fiasco. Therefore, in conclusion, I would like to express my wish for the brotherly people of Ukraine to finally gain freedom and the opportunity to build a society that would respect fundamental human rights and national identity and would live in peace with its neighbors. That hour is already close, despite all the efforts of the Kiev regime and its Western patrons. Thank you.